In the previous videos, I've talked about Parashar's method of determining the strength of yogas. Before we continue with the course, I wanted to explain the calculation tables in Kala a little more clearly. We're going to be using these tables in a way that can be a little confusing if you don't know exactly where everything is. So I just wanted to go over this table a little bit more. And to do that, we're going to use a chart of Julia Roberts, the American actress. So down here on the bottom right, we have got the planets along with their Ishta and Kashta, which are their good and ill tendencies, their Shubha and Ashubha, which are the auspicious and inauspicious fruits that the planets will give based on its dignities in the Sapta Vargas, or the 7 divisional charts. And then the Shubha and Ashubha Dig Bala, which is the strength the planet gets for good or trouble based on its Dig Bala. And of course, Ishta and Kashta, if you'll remember, are determined by a combination of the planet's Shashta Bala and its Ucha Bala. So Shashta Bala is how close it is to the Sun. When a planet's conjunct the Sun and not retrograde, its Ishta is really low at 0. When it's opposite the Sun and retrograde, its Ishta, or its Shashta Bala is really high, it's 60. And Mercury and Venus, when they're retrograde and conjunct the Sun, their Shashta Bala is 60, nice and high. So that's one of the Shad Balas. We also look at the Ucha Bala, which is how far a planet is from its deep exaltation. If a planet's right at its deep exaltation degree, it gets 60 points, and if it's opposite that exaltation degree, it gets 0 points. And then those two values, the Shashta Bala and the Ucha Bala, are averaged out to create the Ishta and Kashta. So all three of these scores, the Ishta Kashta, the Subha and Asubha Phala, and the Subha and Asubha Dig Bala, are meant to be used together. Brihat Parashara has a chapter called Ishta and Kashta, where he talks about these three values and tells us to use them all together. So they're basically all multiplied by each other. And these are all fractions, so we end up with some pretty low numbers. The total plus in Julia Roberts' chart, for instance, is Sun is 0.3, Moon is 3.6, Mars is 9.4, Mercury is 3.9, Jupiter is 4.0, Venus is 4.0, and Saturn's 1.0. When you compare that to the bad's almost always going to be a lot higher. It's uncommon for a planet to have a lot better, a much better high value than or positive value than the negative value. The negative value will almost always be higher. So Julia Roberts' Sun has negative value of 29.8, 9.1 for the Moon, 4.3 for Mars, 5.1 for Mercury, 5.4 for Jupiter, 4.7 for Venus, and 13.6 for Saturn. The reason the low points are always going to be lower is because the Ashubha Phala always favors the negative, and that's based on the dignities in the Vargas. And a planet in bad dignity in a Varga always gets way more bad points than good points. And even a planet in decent dignity, like a friend sign, gets more bad points than good points. So when you just look at these numbers, it'll appear like everyone's chart is horrible and they don't have a chance in life. But we have to use these numbers intelligently and correctly, which means we have to use these numbers when we evaluate yogas. When we're talking about bad yogas that cause destruction, death, and decay and losses, we use the bad numbers. When we are looking at good yogas that give wealth, success, and fame and enjoyments in life, we have to look at the good numbers. Okay? There's many, many more yogas that produce things and give things than there are yogas that destroy things. And so that's why life does work out. So it's not these numbers that determine whether a planet's good or bad. A lot of astrologers have tried to use these numbers, the Ishta, Kashta numbers, and so on, to see if a planet will behave good or bad, and they've all given up because it didn't work. We're not meant to use those numbers to see if a planet's good or bad. We're meant to use yogas to see if a planet's going to produce a good yoga or if it's forming a bad yoga. If it's forming a good yoga, we use the good value to see how much good. And if it's a bad yoga, we see the negative value to see how much bad. So these numbers are not qualifying numbers. They don't qualify a planet as good or bad. They're quantifying numbers. They indicate the quantity of good or bad as the case may be. There's more good yogas than bad yogas, so things work out nicely. But when there's bad yogas, they tend to hurt really, really bad because of the fact that the values of the negatives values, the unfavorable values, are almost always going to be very high relatively to the good. So life works out. There's more good things in life, but when bad things happen, they're usually worse than the good things that happen on average. That's how life is. So with these tables as an example, we would use these numbers to judge the strength of yogas. So an example, we can pull up the core yogas, which are the important named yogas in Julia Roberts' chart. And we see we got this yoga called Kala yoga, which means a large drum. And a drum is, something you beat on as you're progressing along the battlefield. You're making progress along the battlefield. And that's sort of what this drum represents, making a progress into life, a steady, focused, successful progress. So people with this Kala yoga are marching to the beat of a drum, which means they're marching somewhere upon a road of success. Julia Roberts has this. It's caused by the dispositor of the Lord of the Rashi occupied by the Lagna Lord is an exaltation Rashi or own Rashi and in an angle or trine. So the dispositor of the Lord of the Rashi occupied by the Lagna Lord. So the Lagna Lord is the first factor. It's in Leo. We need to take the Lord of that Rashi, which is the Sun. It's the second factor. It's in Scorpio. Then in the fifth sign. Then we have to take the third factor, which is the dispositor or ruler of this Sun. And if it's an exaltation or own Rashi and in an angle or trine, the person gets the Kala yoga. Well, in Julia Roberts' case, this Mars, who's the Lord of the Lagna Lord, is in the seventh in angle in Capricorn in exaltation. So she has the Kala yoga caused by Moon, Sun, and Mars. So we know all three of those planets are going to produce success and progress in her life. The Moon gets 3.6 points to produce success. That's its good value. Its bad value of 9.1, we don't care about that when we're analyzing this yoga. We only care about the good value of 3.6. The Sun, one of the other components in this yoga, has a good value of just 0.3. Not a whole lot, okay? But some good, and it's forming a good yoga. Then Mars gets 9.4 points. Mars is rocking. So out of these three planets, Sun, Moon, and Mars, which planet is going to produce the best yoga effects? Well, based on this Kala yoga, it's going to be Mars, because he produces 9.4 compared to the Moon's 3.6. So in telling Julia, we could tell her you're going to be famous in the Sun dasha, and in that dasha, Sun will give some fame. Sun Moon will give more fame because Moon is stronger than Sun. But Sun Mars will give the most fame because Mars is even stronger than the Moon. And that's exactly what happened to her. In Sun dasha, in fact, 2 weeks after Sun dasha started, she was in a movie called Steel Magnolias. She wasn't a primary person in it, but she got a lot of attention in it. There was a lot of big stars in that movie, Steel Magnolias, and she really shone in that movie. And even though she wasn't cast as a main person in the movie, everyone loved her role, and she got a lot of recognition. That was her first time where she was recognized publicly in a big way in Sun dasha. Okay, then in Sun Moon dasha, the movie Pretty Woman came out, which was the most successful romantic comedy of all time. It's considered the literally the most successful romantic comedy ever made to date. So that happened in Sun Moon. Now Moon is causing 3.6. Moon is ruling the first house, and it's in the second in Leo. Leo is really good for Leo represents your own country always. Leo and the fourth house represent your own country, where you live, your nation, basically. So she had a lot of success domestically under the moon dasha, or a sub-period of moon. After sub-period of moon, she went into Mars, moon Mars, or excuse me, sun Mars. In sun Mars, these two planets are also, Mars is the other planet that represents or takes part in the Kahala Yoga. In sun Mars, Pretty Woman was was released internationally in every other country in the world. And so in sun Mars, she became an international superstar. Okay? Now, it's interesting because Rahu rules foreign places, and the 7th house rules foreign places. And here Mars rules Rahu, and it's placed in the 7th house of foreign places. So that's when she became an international superstar. And her Pretty Woman was released, internationally. Under sub-period of moon, Leo, the 4th house, and Ketu all represent domestic concerns of your own native country. And the moon sitting in Leo, her own territory, her own country. So she didn't get international fame until Mars. Then she became an international superstar. And that was the high point of her success. Okay? So we can see that, the sun dasha was going to be good because of its forming a Kahala Yoga. And of course she was successful, after sun and into moon and everything. But the sun dasha was the first dasha to give fame for her. Okay? So this is just a real simple example of how we can use these values to evaluate yogas. Okay, but what I mostly wanted to explain today, because I've already explained that table in another video and we've used that table, is this table on the upper right, because this table can get a little confusing. And this is the table we need to use for the Karaka Arishta yogas, which are yogas that are formed by benefics or malefics joining or aspecting a Karaka, or being in the 4th, 6th, or 8th from a Karaka, or being on both sides of a Karaka. So for instance, first, the benefics in those positions will help a Karaka feel good and flourish and heal and benefit. A cruel planet or malefic in those places will cause a Karaka to suffer pain and anguish and physical problems and possibly even death. Okay? So in Julia Roberts' chart, we see Venus, which is the Karaka of relationships. It's also the Karaka of the father. It's the Karaka of marriage. It's the Karaka of vehicles. Is with Jupiter, which will help all those things survive the turmoils of life. But then Venus has got Ketu in the 2nd from it, and waning moon, who's a malefic, in the 12th from it. So that will make Venus suffer. So relationships, the father, vehicles will suffer due to this hemming in of moon and Ketu. There's no planets in the 4th from Venus, but there is 2 cruel planets or malefics in the 8th from Venus. That's Saturn and Rahu. So Saturn and Rahu are going to hurt things such as the father, vehicles, and marriage. Okay? And, damage those things, strain those things, and stress those things. But the question is always, how badly will something get strained and stressed? Okay? For that, we have to resort to the numbers. Okay? So since we're analyzing Venus and the positions from Venus, we'd want to click on Venus over here on the right side of the screen, and then we get all the calculations done from Venus's point of view. So when we're looking at the 4th house here, we're looking at the 4th from Venus now, and the influences of the planets by conjunction and aspect to the 4th from Venus. And these influences, the green influences, are the favorable influences based on the Ishta, the good of the planet, the Ashubha, the auspiciousness of the planet, and the planet's Dig Bala. These negative numbers, which are in red, are based on the planet's Kashta, its ill, its Ashubha or inauspicious fruits, and its negative Dig Bala. Okay? And again, those calculations I've already explained all in the beginning of this course, but I'm just explaining this table a little bit more here. So now we're reading everything from Venus. So these are the values to the 4th from Venus, and so on. Well, from Venus, from the 1st from Venus, we have Jupiter, right? how much is Jupiter helping Venus? How much is Jupiter going to help vehicles, the father, and marriage heal? Well, it'll help it to 1.8 points, the green number. We use the green number because Jupiter in this yoga is going to be a helpful influence, or a vitalizing influence. Then we've got K2 in the second from Venus, and the moon in the 12th as a cruel planet, a waning moon. So that's going to, wedge Venus and harm Venus. How much is it going to harm it? Well, Venus is, from the second from Venus, we get the moon is hurting to 1.8 points. Moon's in the 12th from Venus, sorry. Moon's hurting the 12th from Venus to 7.1 points. K2 in the second from Venus is hurting Venus to 7.9 points. So we got to add the moon's 7.1 to K2's 2.9, which comes out to 10 points. And then we divide it by 2 and take the average. So K2 moon on average are smashing Venus to 5 points. That's a lot because Venus only has 4 points of strength here. Okay? His good is 4 points. So Venus K2, Venus moon can all hurt Venetian type things in her life. Julia Roberts has probably had more relationships than any other superstar, in and out of relationships. She's actually ran away from the altar with, and only to date another guy the next day. Okay, so you can see this Venus is very stressed when it comes, and strained when it comes to marriage and relationships. One of the things it's the Cara of. If Venus had been stronger, or the moon and K2 weaker in their evil influences, they wouldn't have hurt Venus as badly. Okay? And even though Jupiter's helping, he's helping to 1.8. These K2 and moon, they're smashing it to a lot of points. But unfortunately for Julia, it gets worse. In the 8th from Venus, one of the other critical places, again, the critical places are the 4th, the 6th, and the 8th. Benefics there help something heal and vitalize something. Cruel planets there wound things. And if they wound them bad enough, the thing can become terminated. So in the 8th from Venus, unfortunately, we got Saturn and Rahu. That's really the gist of her relationship problems, unfortunately, and also other problems I'm going to talk about in a minute. Well, how bad are they hurting? Well, in the 8th from Venus, we've got Saturn causing 8.6 points of damage, and Rahu causing 9.1 of damage. So that's a lot of damage. So Venus, Saturn, and Venus, Rahu both can cause a lot of trouble to the Karaka Venus. And one of the important things that Venus represents is the father. Parashara and Brihat Parashara largely talks about the sun being father. But there is one sutra in Parashara where he does mention, where he talks about sun being father. But there is a chapter where he talks about Venus representing the father. Jaimini, of course, gives the father as Venus. And in another place, Jaimini tells us to take sun or Venus as the father. But the point is, both the sun and Venus represent your father, and trouble to those planets can cause trouble to the father. In so many cases of people who lost their father at a young age, I would see an afflicted Venus. Okay? Now, how come Venus is the father? That's a big shock to some people, so I'll explain that a bit. The father and mother both have a dual role in our lives. Nobody else has a dual role in our life other than our fathers and mothers. And because of that, we have both. Two planets represent the father and mother. For the mother, it's the moon and Mars that represent the mother. For the father, it's Venus and the sun. Okay? Because they play, like I said, a dual role. So for the mother, the dual role, she is in your life, in our lives as a person with a personality, and that personality is going to influence us. And that's the moon. That's your mother as a personality, as an individual, how she is. Her happiness, her unhappiness, her depressions, her sadness, or her joys. Okay? That's your moon. So someone who has an afflicted moon had an unhappy mother. Someone with a nice, robust moon had a happy mother. Pretty simple. But Mars represents the mother in her actions upon us. how our mom takes care of us, her actions upon us. And that begins with her physical health, because the first action the mother has upon us is nurturing us while we're in the womb. While she's nurturing us in the womb, she has to feed us. And if she has a good, healthy, strong body, we get lots of food and we're happy. If she has a weak, sick body, we're sitting there in the womb getting weak and sick too. Okay? So from the very beginning, the mother is nurturing us through Mars. Okay? And taking care of us and providing for us and fighting for us and doing whatever it can to keep us alive. Then the mother has to go through the most painful thing on earth, which is birth, and Mars represents painful things. And then mom has to protect us and feed us and do all day long. And that's Mars as the mother. It's the doing role, the mother. It's what the mother does for one. The moon represents the mother as a person, though. And so the mother plays a dual role. She's a person in our lives, but she's also the one that gives birth to us. Okay? Now the father has a dual role too, and that's through Venus and the sun. The father as a person in our life is the sun. Okay? His personal strengths, his personal weaknesses, his character, his ability to manage life, to provide for the family is largely the sun. But then the DNA that we inherit from the father, the passive thing that the father gives, is Venus. All right? So Venus gives the DNA through the father, and it literally represents the DNA of the father. Your strongest DNA connections actually indicated by Venus, okay, to the father. So Venus produces the DNA that links us to the father. So he has the role as the person who impregnated the mother, as this, he has a role as the sperm that, ovulated or, that fertilized the egg, okay? And that's Venus. And of course, Venus represents semen, according to Parashara. And then the sun is the father as an active person in our life. So we have to look at both of those. Afflictions to either of those can cause trouble to the father or the mother in the case of Moon and Mars. Now, Julia Roberts is also interesting, is that if we look at the sun, which is the Karaka father as well, we see that Saturn and Rahu are in the 6th from the sun, which is another no-no place. You don't want malefics in the 4th, 6th, or 8th from Karakas. If they do, they'll cause trouble. So if you're running, say, Venus, Rahu, and Rahu's in the 4th, 6th, or 8th from Venus, chances are your relationship will very likely end, but failing that, it's going to be extremely strained. Whether it ends or gets strained, we have to look at the numbers. But it's like that for all the things that Venus or any planet might rule. So the sun here, has Saturn and Rahu in the 6th. How strong is the sun? Well, it's not very strong. It's only 0.3 points. Why is it so weak? Because it's too close to the 4th house where it loses all of its Dig Bala. It's too close to Libra where it's debilitated, so it loses its Ucha Bala. So it's a weak sun. Look at its Dig Bala, 4.7. Its bad is 55.3. Its Ishta is just 10.8 because it's so close to its debilitation in Libra. So it's just not a very good sun. It's also close to Capricorn than it is Cancer, where the sun gets strong. It's weaker down here, higher up north. So the sun is just a really weak sun. And then having Rahu and Saturn in the 6th from that is really bad. How bad is it? Well, let's click over to this table. And now we can see all the planetary positions from the sun. So from the sun, we go to the 6th where Rahu and Saturn are, and we see that Saturn's causing 12.2 points of damage and Rahu 2.8. That's a lot of damage to a planet that only has 0.3 points of help. There's no benefics in the 4th, 6th, or 8th from Venus, but we do have Mercury with the sun, which can help. How much is it helping? Well, from the 1st to the sun, Mercury is there and helping to 2.5 points. Strong enough to prevent Rahu from harming the father, because Rahu's only harming the father. Oh, actually, it's 2.8. So not quite strong enough to help from Rahu, and certainly not strong enough to save from Saturn's 12.2 points of damage. So not only is the Sun, one Karaka father, getting smashed by Saturn and Rahu, Venus, the other Karaka of Saturn, father is getting smashed by Saturn and Rahu. So it's no surprise that in Venus, Rahu, Saturn, her father died. Okay, when she was 10 years old, Venus, Rahu, Saturn, her father died. So this is just a simple example how we would use these tables. Anytime there's a yoga that asks for this in the 4th or 5th or in any house position from any house or from any planet, we need to mathematically evaluate that planet to see how strong it is. And judging yoga strength is always an important thing, because you might see the same yoga in two charts. One person has a lot of success with the yoga, and the other person only has some success in the yoga. The reason being because of the strength of the yoga. And these are the calculations that Parashara wants us to use for judging yogas. In fact, after the Ishta and Kashta chapter in Brihat Parashara, there's a few chapters on Jaimini. None of those Jaimini chapters are meant to be in Brihat Parashara. They're all interpolations. They just don't belong here. In fact, they're all corrupted. All the Jaimini Sutra stuff in Parashara, you just don't want to read it. Don't even bother reading it, because it's all wrong. All the technical parts are wrong. Some of the result types and descriptions of planets are right, but the actual technical thing, the application in Parashara, unfortunately is wrong, because those chapters were added and were never meant to be part of Brihat Parashara. They are just bad translations that got stuck in there when Brihat Parashara was recompiled in the 1800s from bits and pieces of paper from all over India. So this is some of the unfortunate things we have to deal with in this book. If you want to do Jaimini, study Jaimini Sutras and learn Sanskrit. Okay, then after the Ishta and Kashta chapter, if we cut out all the Jaimini stuff, we get to the first really important yoga chapter called Yoga Karakas, which has to do with, the yoga karakas, like for Cancer, Mars rules the 5th and 10th, and therefore becomes a yoga karaka. And then after that, he gets into the Nabhas yogas, which are critical yogas. And then he gets into all the named yogas, like this yoga, the Kahala yoga, and all the other yogas that have specific purposeful names. And then he gets into lunar yogas, solar yogas, Raj yogas, and all types of, basically, yogas. It's all about yogas after that. The reason he does that, first he gives the mathematical calculations for analyzing yogas with the Ishta and Kashta, the Shubha and Ashubha, and the Shubha and Ashubha Dig. And then he gives the yogas to use these calculations with. So this is, this video was really just to explain how Kala calculates all these things, so that as you learn a yoga and want to apply it, you know what table to look at and how to use it. This table up here, this big long one, is for any time you want to see the influence of planets from any other planet or point. So when I click on the sun gets turned into red to remind me that I'm looking at these numbers from the sun. If I click on Saturn, it's all being read from Saturn. If I click on the 12th, it's all read from the 12th cusp. If I click on 4th, it's all read from the 4th cusp, and the Lagna cusp will actually move to the 4th. This is done so that if we wanted to predict things about the mother, for instance, we would want to read everything from the 4th house, from the 4th cusp, and see all the numbers from there. Okay. The table down here in the bottom right are just the sheer strengths of the planets before measuring any influences to the other planets. That's just the independent individual strengths of the planets, both strength for good and strength for bad when it's in a bad yoga. Here we've got the Shubha, Ishta, Dig to Grahas. These are the aspects and conjunctions of one planet to another, measured out mathematically the way Parashara wants us to. Parashara doesn't want us to use full aspects, so-called full aspects. He wants us to calculate the aspects between a value of 0 and 60. And then that aspect strength has to be, modified by the strength of the planets, which is done in this table. So anytime we were requesting an aspect to something, we'd look here. So one of the things Parashara does tell us to do is to look at the benefic and malefic aspects to a karaka, the same way that we looked at the benefics and malefics being in the 4th, 6th, and 8th from a karaka or conjuncted. So we can do that real simply with the sun here. We have Mercury conjunct as a benefic to 2.5 points, Jupiter aspects to a slim 1.2 point, Venus aspects to a slim 0.5 points as benefics, which are going to help the sun regenerate and recuperate. But if we look at the cruel aspects, we see 3.7 of Moon, the malefic aspects, and 10.5 of Saturn, okay, which is just too much. But Saturn's even worse than 10.5 because he's in the 6th from the sun, where, like I said, he puts out 11.5 points of damage and contributed to the death of father at the age of 10. So anytime a yoga asks for aspects or conjunctions, we would use this table here. Okay. Then anytime a yoga asks for an aspect to a house cusp, we would use these numbers. If the yoga asks for, is a good yoga and it asks for a good planet to aspect the ascendant, we would look at the good value of the planet. If the yoga asked for, was in bad yoga that asked for an aspect to a house, to the ascendant, for instance, and that aspect was going to cause damage to the first house, then we'd use the red number, the unfortunate number, okay, which is the planet's quantity to damage a bhava based on a yoga. Now, important thing to remember is these values of Ishta, Shubha, and Shubha, these values, are only meant for yoga judgment. They're not meant for a technical analysis of the bhavas. For that, Parashar has other mathematical techniques. These yogas are meant to be used. These calculations are specifically meant for judging the degree of effects of a yoga. If you see a good yoga, you use the good numbers, the green numbers, the auspicious values. If it's a bad yoga, you use the inauspicious values, the red numbers. But the numbers themselves don't make a planet good or bad. It's the yogas that make the planet good or bad. And then we see how strong the yoga is for good or bad using those numbers. And we only use these numbers for yoga analysis. They have no other purpose other than to analyze yogas. For judging bhavas, Parashar has a whole different set of principles. And really we need to use those set of principles simultaneously with yogas, because the planet will always be affecting bhavas. So we have to see how the planet's affecting bhavas. Then we also need to see the yogas the planet's forming, and those things will also happen. So the Rashi chart really clearly illustrates the trouble to the father to happen in Venus, Rahu, Saturn. But again, we should always check in Varga charts to make sure if everything's working out, and if it's really the father or some other Venetian thing that might suffer, because Venus, in addition to representing the father, represents vehicles, marriage, and a wife if you're male, and lots of other things. So for that, we can go to the Dwadasamsha, which has to do with parents. And when a person loses a parent, not necessarily according to death, but in any fashion, usually there'll be some tragedy in the 12th Varga. In this case, Venus rules the 10th bhava cusp, which is the bhava of the father. It also rules the 8th from there, so it has the potential to cause trouble to the father. And when I say Venus rules the 10th bhava cusp, what I mean by that is that if I go to the Rashi chart and I take the 10th cusp, which falls in Aries, in fact it falls exactly at 1645 Aries, and I calculate the Dwadasamsha for 1645 Aries, I'm going to get at the 10th cusp falling in Libra. So this represents the concrete, materially existing father in her life, the 10th cusp. Now, both the 9th and 10th have been said to represent father. Parashar says the 10th, and that's what I usually go with. The 9th represents the parents, which in traditional Indian society, the parents are dominated by the father's culture because the mother goes and lives with the father in the father's family. And so the father's culture becomes the strongest influencing parental influence. But really the 9th house are the parents as a unit raising you. The 4th house is your mother, and the 10th house is your father as an individual. But as a group of parents raising you, it's the 9th. That's why afflictions to the 9th, and when the dashas of afflictions to the 9th run, will indicate divorce of parents, when the parents are having trouble as a unit and fall apart. Okay? All right. So Venus over here rules that father. It's in the 7th, the Marka house from the father, death-inflicting house from the father, and it rules the 8th, the house of longevity and death. 8th Lord in 7th is never great for longevity. And from the father, we got the Lord of the 8th Rashi sitting in the 7th Rashi from the father in Libra here. Okay, 10th house cuts father. So not really good. Then Rahu is in the 12th from Venus, the Antardasha Lord. And not only is it in the 12th from Venus, which can cause some trouble, more importantly is it's in the 6th house, the house of disease, from Libra, and therefore can cause, trouble and disease to father. And then Jupiter, which rules Rahu, is placed in the 12th, from Libra. Again, we're reading this all from Libra here. Okay, in fact, let's just read this from the 10th. This will make it easier. So I clicked on here, and now it's all being calculated from Libra. So from Libra, Rahu's in the 6th, and its Lord is in the 12th. 6th Lord in 12th is always a potentially death-inflicting period. And Rahu effectively acts like Jupiter, the 6th Lord, in the 12th, if the 6th Lord is in bad shape. And Jupiter is in really bad shape because if we look at him as the 6th Lord, he's conjunct Venus in the Rashi, and Venus is going to hurt that Jupiter. Venus always hurts Jupiter as a Bhava Lord. And so Rahu is not going to do well because of that, and therefore Venus Rahu causes death. I don't want to get into that more technically because that's not the subject of this video. The judging the bhavas and the death-inflicting planets according to bhavas is not the subject of this video, and I don't want to make this video 2 hours long. But I just wanted to point out that we should always, if we see something in the Rashi, we should always, of course, verify it in the Varga chart. And this certainly shows trouble to father during Venus Rahu. Okay? Due to this Rahu being in the 12th from Venus, Venus being the 8th Lord from the father, and Rahu's Lord Jupiter, first being in a natural enemy sign where it has no strength, second being with a cruel planet, K2, and third being conjunct Venus in the Rashi chart, amongst other things, but we're not going to deal with all that. So father dies in Venus Rahu, unfortunately. Okay, so I hope this helps you use this screen. So those of you who have Kala and have yogas, you know enough now to, get through this screen and make the most of your yogas and analyze your yogas most effectively. Okay, that's sort of the goal of this video. This video is a part of a course where I have taught lots of yogas using all these tables. And I highly recommend that course. It's at astrologyvideos.com. But even if you don't take that course, this should be enough to explain how to use the Ishta Shubha and the Shubha Dig Bala and their negative counterparts to analyze your yogas most effectively, according to the method of Brihat Parashara. Thank you.